Hello and welcome to the second episode of Briefed, the fortnightly writing competition on Cam FM 97.2. Get that shout out there, all important. It is I, Cameron White, and joining me, of course, is co-host Anna Freeman.
Hello, how are you, Cameron?
Yeah, I'm very good. How is the sort of eased lockdown life treating you?
It's good, it's good. It's quite tranquil near me. I live in quite a rural area, so it doesn't feel like there's too like a crush. There's no Bournemouth beaches near me, so it's sort of a bit like business as usual. But it's all right. How is doing the introduction?
Well, I've lost my introduction virginity on this show, as it were.
Right.
Yeah, certainly something. What a feeling.
How you can wheel doing
Exactly,
the introduction.
exactly. So, I hope you're all doing well, dear listeners. So the brief for this show was to submit a piece of pretty much any genre based on the famous quotation from Raymond Chandler, "To say goodbye is to die a little." And thank you very much for the 5 submissions that we had
Yes.
this week. And Anna, would you like to explain the structure of the show today?
I certainly can do. So for this show, I don't know if you listened to last show, but we had a very special submission from professional author and poet Helen Mort. And I reached out to her, asking her if she'd like to sort of do a little interview for the show. And amazingly, she said yes. So we have an interview by her where she gives some advice to sort of aspiring writers, her own writing journey, that sort of thing. So before we get on to the main entries for this show, I'm very excited to introduce the interview with award-winning poet and novelist Helen Mort. Enjoy. Helen, how did you find writing to a brief?
So I think that probably like many people, I've struggled to carve out time for my writing over the past few months in the strange circumstances we've all been in. Mostly for me, it's been juggling other bits of paid work and childcare. And I found that normally I wait for ideas to arrive. I don't really set myself exercises or prompts. And to have a challenge like this, to get those words into a poem and just to give myself a reason to sit down and try something, to send it in, was really great for me. It allowed me to carve out some time for my writing. And it's also just really fun to write in a different way and to do something you wouldn't normally. Also, I just really applauded the idea of trying to use the word cactus in a poem. I don't think I've ever used that in a poem before. So what a great idea. There's such a symbol of that. That's what my starting point was. I was just thinking about the cactus as a symbol of resilience, but also the idea that you don't have to look after them in the way you have to look after other plants. And it brought back all kinds of memories and ideas and associations. So yeah, it was great to have a word like that, actually. Yeah.
Great. And sort of on that theme, we just have a quick question from our co-host Cameron about your poem, Moving In, and in particular the line, "Our home grows even without water." Now he wanted to know, obviously you've got the collective pronoun our, but he was wondering how a household with a newborn relates to a cactus. I guess you've already sort of answered it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's that idea that sometimes in your life, we're all so, I think we all, don't we, to varying degrees, feel the pressure to achieve things and to get things done. And that happens as a creative person, even though we sometimes think it's more kind of a free-flowing way of working. But there's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves. And I remember finding the first year of my son's life quite strange because I wasn't doing any of the things that had defined who I was for the last however many decades. And suddenly a lot of time seems like time that you're not spending constructively. And of course, with the baby, you have to completely undo that way of thinking and realize that it's enough to just be there sometimes, and that you're actually doing something incredibly important just with your presence and just by being nurturing and being loving, and that you it's not about where you go or what you get done. So I was thinking about that idea of you don't always have to to strive all the time and monitor things. It's enough to just let it exist and do a bit of existing. And that again made me think of the cactus and the idea of flourishing without water and things like that. And also the tenacity of babies and their incredible resilience and how they grow. I think that's fascinating too.
And another question from one of our listeners. What's your writing process, not just for this, but just in general?
So I've never been somebody who, I know everybody likes to work very differently, and I think it can be a mistake to compare ourselves too much to other writers, because it just, things work for different people. But I've never been someone who writes in a particular routine or structure. Certainly don't write every day. I tend to wait. I carry a lot of ideas around in my head, and I sometimes take them out running with me. You mentioned that I do quite a bit of running or walking, and turn them over and sort of wait until one idea connects with another. And then only when I feel that sense of urgency might I sit down and write something. Of course, that can very easily slip over into being a bit lazy and not writing when you should. And that's the nice thing about a commission or an exercise like this one for Brief, because I think sometimes you can draw things out of your mind when you don't think you have any ideas, and that's a kind of different way of getting yourself working. But yeah, I've always been somebody who waits for inspiration rather than always going out looking for it. Although I do read hugely. That's the thing about my writing routine that's never changed, is the quantity of reading that I do. I count that as sort of exercising my writing muscles, is reading widely.
Definitely. And yeah, I like that idea of sort of the waiting for the inspiration, not trying to force the idea, just and then when it comes, just mulling it over, turning it over in your mind.
But I do know great writers who absolutely make themselves write every day no matter what, and that works for them. I think we're all so different, and it's worth trying out a few different things to see what fits with your lifestyle, but also not giving yourself too much of a hard time if for whatever reason you can't write for a while. I think it's always there, it never leaves you.
So when starting out writing, often some people try and advise you write what you know. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's such a complicated one as well. I do think that, I think on the one hand, there is a huge wealth of experience in whatever it is that you do know, and you shouldn't feel as a writer that whatever your knowledge or your background is, that it's not a worthy subject for writing. I remember thinking that early on. I grew up in Chesterfield, just outside Sheffield, and I just remember thinking, is there much I can write about where I come from that would be interesting to anyone else, but at the same time felt a really strong urge to write about the landscapes. It was very much a part of me. And I remember reading poets like Simon Armitage and Ian Macmillan and realising that it was legitimate to write about the everyday and about whatever kind of background you come from. So in that sense, writing about what you know is really valuable. Equally, though, I don't think we should be too scared of not going near things because they're outside our experience, because writing is an act of empathy, ultimately, and I think you can imagine yourself, even if you've had a similar experience or there'll be a connection. I know for myself, and I found this with my novel very much, my first novel, a lot of which is to do with things outside my own direct experience. So, for instance, some of it deals with the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster in Sheffield and the impact on police and on the community. And that was something I had to research, and it was something that I needed to put a lot of work into. It's not my own world. But I think once you get something like that you feel compelled to write about, you can always trace it back to something in you. There's always a reason why you feel you need to investigate that story or tell it. So I think it works both ways. What you know can be very rich and rewarding, but it's okay to use your imagination as well. Obviously, there's a difference between using your imagination and just appropriating things or, stepping on someone else's toes. But I think that tricky line is where some of the best writing is, where you're writing into the unknown to an extent, but you're also drawing on parts of your own life.
Brilliant. And something, I guess, a bit more specific to our radio station. As we're broadcasting on Cam FM, many of our listeners are students of Cambridge University. I know you went to Christ's College. How would you say being at Cambridge has helped you or hindered you in your career?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I think with hindsight, you always think that you could have done things differently, and you don't always make the most of opportunities that are given to you. I have to admit, I didn't always. I spent some of my time at university feeling a bit of an outsider in some ways. Perhaps that's what writers always do. Perhaps they like to do that to some extent. And I sort of wish I'd thrown myself into things more. And kind of particularly in terms of writing or like actually radio and things that I'm really passionate about. And I wish that I'd been involved with things like that and just been more confident in general. But I think it has hugely helped me in terms of the variety of different people who you meet and who you encounter again, later on. And your just exposure to a great literature scene. So it wasn't really the university, but Cambridge as a town really helped me on my way to being a poet, because I was involved with running a local poetry group called CB1 Poetry, which started off doing open mic, and then we got funding and we made it into a reading series. And that was really nice because it spanned the university and the town, and it brought a lot of people together in this poetry series. And that I made connections there, met people, listened to things, saw things that have absolutely influenced my, not even so much my writing maybe, but my life in the writing world and in facilitating other writers and things like that. So everyone, I think, yeah.
What advice would you give to any aspiring writers, student or otherwise?
I always want somebody to come and give me advice, even now. So I can't think of myself as expert enough to advise, really. But I guess just it's easier said than done. But try not to edit and censor yourself too much in your life as a writer, in your processes. Don't stop yourself from tackling the things that you want to tackle, I think, and worry about the details of it later when you're editing. Or it's so easy to stop yourself from writing something or feel that you're not entitled to. And as someone who teaches as well at a university, but also freelance, I work with so many people, and particularly so many women and young women who are really talented writers, artists, and who I'd say their biggest problem is that they lack confidence. So, I mean, it's not as easy as waving a magic wand to get that confidence, but I think if you can work on that, that's almost as important as working on the craft itself. And the other thing would just be to read, and read things that you don't necessarily think you're going to like, or that you don't think's your kind of thing. Swap books with friends who have different tastes. Find out what it is that excites you about literature and about your chosen art form, and bring all those the best influences, disparate influences together. To write about the things that you care passionately about. And none of us can do anything entirely new. I think there's nothing new under the sun in terms of writing, but we can assimilate things in a way that is completely unique. And I think that's a good place to start from, really, that idea of assimilation.
Oh, thank you so much. These have been some incredible insights. Hopefully our student writers will take some of your lovely advice. If you're interested in reading any more of Helen's work, she has multiple poetry anthologies, and her debut novel, Black Card Burning, is available in all good bookshops. Helen, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Once again, thank you so much to Helen for giving us her time. I'm sure she's incredibly busy. And like I said, you can catch lots of Helen's work in all good bookshops. I would definitely recommend. So now on to the main body of our show. And obviously last episode we read out all the entries and we had an extended YouTube episode, but we sadly won't have time for this today, so we're going to just sort of very briefly talk about some of the entries that we received and then get on to our winning entry. So one of our entries was from Lewis Davis about called Cryonauts, and that was really interesting. It was certainly something I wasn't expecting to receive. It was a sort of sci-fi, little bit dystopian short story, I should say. And I think for me it was the most creative use of the brief, because when I read it I didn't immediately, it wasn't sort of forced into my mind, goodbye, die a little, those sort of two elements. But the character himself, we'll put these up on Facebook so you'll be able to read them after the show in full. But the main character, who has cryogenically been frozen, I think for about 11 years. It says in the piece itself, which is like 110 or something like that. He himself has sort of died a little in the cryogenically freezing, and then he obviously says goodbye to all his previous. He says he doesn't have any family, but he has friends and a life, so he's left those behind. So it's sort of a subtle realization. And the other main character tries to sort of get some sort of juicy details on his previous life and why he chose to freeze, but he's not really willing to give those up. So as a reader, you're thinking what actually happened, and it's quite mysterious. And it's a very interesting dynamic in the piece as a whole, I think. And it's interesting how, even though it's a sci-fi, I think Lewis doesn't play into the flying car stereotype that you might see in Back to the Future or anything like that. It seems very realistic, and the striking thing is that not much has changed, which I think is an interesting sort of angle to take.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, we also had an extremely interesting submission from Sandy B from Yorkshire once again. Sandy says that she's been listening to and reading about the Old Welsh and Cornish verse form, Englanian, or Englanian, yeah, we'll go with that.
We'll go with that.
Especially poems by the iconic Welsh shepherd poet Hedwyn. Apologies if I've offended any Welsh people there with that pronunciation. And what she describes as beautiful, meditative word pictures. She said she liked the discipline and challenge of the tight, short form, thinking of them as Celtic haiku. And for her particular submission, she chose the Soldier's England form, which was 3 lines of 7 syllables each. And all rhymed, and this was the form in fact used by young women in the Great War to send embroidered love poems to their sweethearts. And
such a sweet little image, isn't it? You can just imagine them doing that when you read the poem, I think.
It really is. You know, the power of poetry to link the household to the trenches. Obviously, it's a beautiful thing. And thank you very much, Sandy, for your submission. And we'll be putting that on Facebook.
Yeah, and along a similar vein, we had 2 actually that were sort of war-inspired, World War-inspired.
Yes.
We had one from Andy Freeman, which was about the Grimsby Chums, and that's sort of a bit something that's not so much, I think, discussed, perhaps, the smaller battalions that were sort of locally famous, but also sort of stuck together through thick and thin. And these ones suffered great losses, as did many in the Battle of the Somme and other battles in the First World War. And let me see what I wrote. So obviously another context-heavy one, which was really interesting. And the one particular line that stood out to me is they talk about spitting the Flanders mud out of their mouths one last time. And I thought, is that true in the way of, is it overly hopeful for the soldiers themselves? Because lots of them would experience shell shock, which we now know as PTSD, and all those things associated with that. So surely that visceral experience of mud in your mouth, or the sort of stench of the rotting bodies in the mud, would come back to haunt them. So even though they're leaving the war, they don't really leave it in their minds, which I think is something that plays on you after you've read the poem itself. And the whole concept of a march, again, is not so typically covered. It reminded me a lot of Wilfred Owen's Exposure, which was quite different to other sort of glorious sort of battle poems which glorified the battles. You think of like Charge of the Light Brigade, whereas Exposure just sort of plays on the reality of being a soldier in the First World War and was freezing to death, just sort of waiting for battle, and that being almost 90% of your time, and that's when lots of men die of exhaustion, of the cold. And this is what it made me think of, the sort of day-to-day mundaneness of, well, not mundane, but mundane for the soldiers, of just sort of plodding and walking and in such uncomfortable environments. So yeah, very, very sensory poem. Thank you very much, Andy.
And also, thank you, Andy, for your poem there. And talking about poetry, we also had another poem called Ciao. which was by Rebecca Siddle. Thank you for yet another submission. We appreciate the support. And this was a poem essentially about two lovers parting. The first line, "There's no moon, no stars tonight." I think that's quite striking in terms of, usually you'd look up to the sky and you'd see the moon and the stars and you'd feel a sense of wonderment, and the fact that the wonderment's not there anymore. There's no sort of the poem's devoid of that sort of sensation of magic, perhaps the magic of being in a relationship and deep into a loving relationship. That's immediately gone from the start.
And
so
I think the reassuring nature of knowing the stars are always there and the moon will always be there. When if you've got a blank sky, it feels empty and just not quite right, which I think is something that Rebecca captures quite well.
Yeah, a sort of loss of the cosmos, as it were. A loss
Star-crossed
of order,
lovers
definitely.
are no longer.
So it's a nice play on that trope, indeed. And also the line, "We're surrounded by the broken pieces of a life packed in boxes." So that's obviously a nice conflation of the material process of moving out of a house and the abstract rupture, the abstract shattering of the relationship. And then the final line is just the verb present tense, shatters, which I thought actually was really striking as well, because it breaks up the rhythm and so quite clearly uses the poetic form to reflect what has happened in the breakdown of the persona's relationship. And as Anna's already said, you'll be able to see this poem along with all of the submissions on our Facebook page.
Definitely. And just a final note on the ending. I completely agree. I really like the ending, and it's, as you'll read on Facebook, it's the part of him that was in her sort of shatters, and I liked it because it could be positive or it could be negative. Like, you think initially it could be negative because obviously shattering is damaging and it's a part of you that's breaking, like your heart breaking, and it feels very wrenching. But then I think a motif throughout the poem is that she, or the persona, needs her lover for warmth, for heat. It talks about how the persona is very cold and the lover is warm, so giving heat, a bit like a sort of sun to a lizard. I know that's a weird metaphor, but you know what I mean. Sort of a life-giving element to it. But then that part of the lover shattering and sort of ripping away shows that the persona is now just themselves. They don't need their lover to sort of complete them and to give them life, because they now are an independent person, which I think is a really, really nice image to finish on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so thank you everybody for your submissions, but ultimately there has to be a winner. And so this week...
Should I do a little drum roll?
Go on. Oh, hang on. I actually need to remember the name of it. That'd be good, wouldn't
it? Drum roll, roll 2.
Right. Yeah, drum roll, roll 2. Here we go. The winner is Luis Almonacid with his poem Joanne's Lament. It was very good indeed. Well done. And now here is Anna reading it.
Okay, so this is Joanne's Lament. She can't remember when we two were one. After the raven came, the look she gave. The love I saw shall haunt me to my grave. Now, everything I knew is wasted, gone. A lost and lonely, shoreless memory. Is there a way to give it back to shore or make it new and as real as before? Is this breaking down my philosophy? No more of doubt. I loved, I love, I'll love, and every breath I call my own is yours, and I'll search every sea for any cures. Our love may be lost, but not gone, I'll prove. Oh, Catherine, I'll never say goodbye. Let it be known that if I do, I'll die. Brilliant. That's an incredible poem, and we're very lucky that we actually have Luis to discuss the poem with. So, on to our interview with Luis himself. Luis, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Not too bad, thank you. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and at such short notice as well. You wrote the wonderful Joanne's Lament, which you just heard us read out. So I guess we'll get straight into the questions. First of all, how did you find writing to the brief? Did it help you, or...?
I would say it definitely did. I sort of approached the brief in the same way, very sadly, that I'd approach an essay question. I looked at the sort of particular phrases in it that I thought were worthy of testing and like sort of pushing out tensions there. And so what it ended up being was interrogating how much is to say goodbye to die, sort of thing. Like, is it a little, is it a lot? And so it was sort of looking for the things I found interesting in that statement that I sort of looked for. Yeah.
Would you say the same thing applied to the first entry you sent us? Because you entered the Curtain Cactus Glass as well last show. Did you think that was a different coming at it because it was just the 3 words, or the more like the longer quote?
I think that, yeah, that definitely felt different, because last week when I was writing it, I was sort of thinking about the images that sort of came to mind with that. It was more like, it felt like more of a piece that sort of sprung out from it, whereas this week I was trying to write something that was more responding to the brief, rather than directly building from it, sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you found that brief interesting to interpret, because I set that, and I suppose I did want to test a relationship between saying goodbye and dying, but also I think death is obviously something that's on a lot of people's minds at the minute. So it was, it's certainly been interesting to see how people have creatively responded to that in the current context. And I mean, reading your piece, there's a couple of interesting motifs, particularly the symbols of the raven and the sea. I mean, what's the significance of those?
Well, this is part of a larger series of bits of writing that I'm sort of working on at the moment, and I came up with the lines. Do you remember when the raven came out on your front porch in the pouring rain? Cornflower blue meets sea vermilion, one bird flying towards oblivion. I live near the sea, and so sort of birds and sea are, I suppose, always on my mind. But I also feel like there's something there beyond just what we'd consider cliches of freedom and flight and those sort of things. I think I was trying to explore how we attach sort of significance to places, really because of their relationships to people, and how these images, which might have a sort of cultural meaning, really take on more of a personal meaning, like rather than, and really that's what's more important in individuals' lives, and sort of that's what I was exploring with those.
I was just thinking the symbol of the raven is definitely interesting, because it can be, I don't know if it's exactly the raven, or like a huge black bird can be sort of death, or it can be ominous, and I think they can be a bit vulture-like as well, can't they? But then you also have like the ravens at the tower, and then if they leave the tower, that's such bad luck, and it sort of brings death in itself. So there's sort of a bit of a contradictory image, and like positive in some ways, like needed, but also kind of a bit shunned, or a bit sort of like seen as a pest, or a bit creepy, that sort of thing. So they carry so many different meanings, and then the personal meaning on top of that is like another layer, which is nice. So last week, your submission was entitled Brief Conversations with Women Twice Born Part 1, and this week you've continued to sort of write about women, but instead of motherhood specifically, it's about female-to-female love. Would you say that Joanne is also a woman twice born, or...?
Possibly by the end of the sequence. I mean, what I was sort of interrogating with that twice born thing, basically Taliesin is one of the 5 sort of great poets of England in mythology, and or Britain rather, because he was Welsh and he's sort of like king of the bards, something like that, king of poets, and he was basically imprisoned by someone and had to escape her. I think it always gets a bit weird and messy and sexual with myths. It's something like he escaped her womb and thus was born again. Yeah, it's very strange. But the sort of more metaphorical idea behind it is that essentially through trials he gains wisdom. And so really what I was just investigating was through that was the idea that women in our society can be subjected to very particular and very intense different forms of scrutiny, which I think lead to specific forms of wisdom. And so it was sort of exploring that. Whereas with this and with Joanne, this is more about her coming to some sort of understanding. And I don't know if she will in the end. I haven't quite decided. Because part of me wants to sort of allow... Because I basically, there are a few different endings you could have. You could have that she recognises her love and its basis as sort of good and factual and wants to hold on to it despite the fact that it's now changed. Or you could have her sort of saying, okay, I need to move on and moving on. Or you could have her moving on but then have the cruel twist of the final lines, her saying goodbye and then falling dead in a sort of monkey's paw style punishment. But I don't know really which way I want to go down yet. So in your question,
that's absolutely fine.
You're talking about like the sort of avenues you want to go down, where you want the sort of writing to end. I mean, on a more general note, I mean, how's it been writing to a brief? And I mean, I suppose, how has writing been during lockdown as well? How's lockdown writing been, and how is the process also affected in terms of writing a submission to a brief?
I'm quite like a goal orientated person. I need a deadline to get anything done. So it's like
Are we all?
So I think writing to a brief has been nice because more than anything else, it's allowed me to basically write ideas I already have, but have a sort of, not a goal in mind, a sort of illusory goal, like something that I think I'm aiming to when really I'm just trying to write the thing. Like the story of Mame Borthwick was something I already knew I wanted to write about. And this was too, like, I'd written other poems in response, but it was just sort of, because any brief is going to have something that's interesting for your story, or most briefs. I don't know if, I think any brief, I think that I can make that claim of it. Sort of like, if you look at a piece of whatever and invest it with enough sort of concentration, you can find something human in it and you can put that into your story. So it's been quite nice writing to a brief just to be able to do that more, basically, and sort of have something to push towards or push against. Because sometimes when I sit down to write, I just sort of go and walk away.
Exactly. That was my idea with the show, to just have a little nugget or something, just to sort of push, like you say, push against, or just sort of to make your mind work harder to like make the challenges. And I think, like you said, no matter what the brief is, I think you can sort of help to make it fit what you actually want to write about. Like, for example, motherhood. Say you want to write about motherhood, but you wasn't sure who to look at or what sort of angle to take or anything like that. And then hopefully what I was hoping for would be the brief would just help channel it a little bit and say, I could actually if I'm talking about cactus, this is a random example I plucked from the air, I could write about X, or, you know, this happening to do with a cactus, and that could show this. So that was hopefully the plan. So I'm really glad that it's helped you in that way. And for a sort of concluding question, although we're sort of easing a bit out of lockdown now, lots of people are still stuck at home, working from home, or are students who are at home for the summer. And do you have any good film, book suggestions that might stave off our boredom?
Inspired by this week's brief, I think I'd recommend The Farewell. I think that's so it's a Chinese film about a extended family, and essentially the grandmother is diagnosed with cancer, but the family makes a collective decision not to tell the grandmother, to keep it a secret from her, and it's sort of about the main character coming to terms with that and sort of wrestling with that. And it's like a nice piece about different cultural expectations around death and saying goodbye and that sort of thing. So The Farewell.
Have a look at that if you want to have, I'm guessing, a little cry and a little deep think. Well, thank you so much, Luis, for coming on the show. It's been amazing and some great insights. And as you heard, Luis's poem is Joanne's Lament. And you should be able to get it on Facebook. I think we'll post that afterwards if you'd like to have another read. So thank you so much. And once again, thank you so much, Luis, for your lovely entry, Joanne's Lament. Now on to the next brief for the next show, and this is going to be a brief of mine. So obviously the show before last, we had 3 sort of inanimate objects, and this one I'm going to try and do it a little bit differently. So it'll still be randomised, but it'll be a randomised sort of abstract concept, if that makes sense. And obviously this won't be for use in the actual piece itself. This can just be your impetus, your starting point. You can think, what are my ideas around, for example, nationhood, what I perceive it to be, what I perceive problems with it or any issues, and then you can sort of put that into the piece, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'll get this randomised. I've got about 20 different concepts that I'm going to randomise, and then that'll be the question. Okay, drum roll. Right, okay, I don't know if this is a concept, but it's just a type of word. It's come up with hatred, which is a little bit negative, but
what sort of ideology are we trying to promote on this show?
So... Yeah, so it doesn't have to be anything too political or anything like that. It can be any kind. So the final brief is write a piece with hatred as your impetus, but go as dark as you like, but don't feel the need to go particularly dark or too politically minded or anything like that. And as usual, any kind of genre, short story, short play, even an essay or a sort of non-fiction-y type piece, anything you'd like. And as usual, our submission email is briefedradio@gmail.com. But just one note about our submission date. We've decided to move it sort of forward a day, so instead of Wednesday at midnight, it'll be Tuesday at midnight, just so we have enough time to interview our winning entry, or interview our winner, and get it edited and things ready for Saturday. So that'll mean the next deadline is Tuesday the 28th of July at midnight, ready for our show on the 1st of August.
And to see this show out, we're going to do something a bit new, is to have a song. And this is a song that I feel quite nicely ties in with the brief, and called The Only Way by Sufjan Stevens. And it is a song which focuses on his struggle with depression in the aftermath of losing his mother.
The only thing that keeps me from driving this car, half-light jackknife into the canyon at night. Signs and wonders, Perseus aligned with a skull, slain Medusa, Pegasus, a light from us all. Do I care if I survive this? Bury the dead where they're found. keeps me from cutting my arm. Crosshatch, warm bath, holiday inn after dark. Signs and wonders, water stain writing the wall. Daniel's message, blood of the moon on us all. Do I care if I despise this? Nothing else matters, I know. In a veil of great disguises, how do I live with your ghost? Should I tear my eyes out now? Everything I see returns to you somehow. Should I tear my heart out now? Everything I feel returns to you somehow. I wanna save you from your sorrow. Should I tear my eyes out now? Everything I see returns to you somehow. Should I tear my heart out now? Everything I feel returns to you somehow.